Paul,
Looking for.
I take it the 2-minute thing stands, right? 2 minutes, yeah, good.
Right. So we do
Not
have
this.
somebody who's coming up for 10 minutes. Dan Suslak. He works in Mexico, and he does some stuff on indigenous and endangered languages, and he does some stuff on youth. And maybe the youth stuff would be.
Good. Daniel?
Yeah, Suslak. And I honestly don't know where it's published. I fear not a lot, unfortunately.
Mexico, indigenous.
Okay. 2 minutes.
2-minute one.
2 minutes. Countdown begins. Have you got me? Give me a symbol. Yeah.
This room, I hate this room because it's so dispersed.
Yeah. In terms of speakers or other,
No, where people sit.
I think we should get rid of the chairs around the sides. Bring them in when you get a big audience or
Maybe
something.
you could just ask people who are sitting along the edge to move up to the table, join us at the table or something.
Yeah, I'll try.
Because otherwise it feels like they're really spread out.
How do we put this?
This when you start and introduce them.
Yeah.
You can be sitting on the edge.
Okay. Of course they'll stay where they are.
No, I know, but
It's like-
it's worth trying.
Yeah.
Any results of the answer department search that you know of?
There may have been, but I don't know. I'm not part of the department. I'm in the education school, so if there's something, all the talks were finished last month. So we had brought in 5 people.
Yeah, how were they?
They were all great.
Yeah.
So now we just have to wait for. Harvard has a very Byzantine process. It won't be so I grew up here. Sort of. Most of them go as adults, though.
It'll be interesting to see.
I was born in Taiwan, so when people ask me, "Are you from China?" I'm like,
Uh-oh, now we're getting to that question.
that question.
It's a loaded political question.
I went and gave a talk at Chicago in March, and I had a long conversation with Julie Chu. Do you know her about this too? 'Cause
Julie.
she also came from Taiwan to the U.S.
Oh, is that her history too?
Yeah, and her family is definitely like Taiwanese background, I think. So she speaks Taiyu. She didn't speak Mandarin growing up. She spoke Taiyu growing up.
Define
But she has a very funny description of coming into the U.S. after 1 bout of doing field work, and the guy was asking her where she'd been in China when she said.
Okay, we're going to start. Sorry. All right, hello everybody. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. For those of you on the sides there are plenty of spaces at the tables if you'd like to gather around. Yes, so welcome to the Wilson Center. My name is Bryce Wakefield. I'm the an Asia Program Associate here at the Center. A few words about the Center for those of you who haven't been here before. The Wilson Center is the nation's official memorial to Woodrow Wilson. It was founded by an act of Congress, and it's here to promote good policy and good scholarship, just as President Wilson no doubt would have wanted it. Today's event is, as you can see by the flyers in front of you, is on Chinese migration, Greater China, migration, and Chinese transnational communities. And joining us here to talk about this topic today, we have some very distinguished scholars. Our first speaker will be Philip Kuhn, who is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He's taught at the University of Chicago as well as at Harvard, where he's professor of Chinese history. His publications include Chinese Among Others, Emigration in Modern Times. Sara Friedman, to my left here, is a fellow here at the Wilson Center. She also comes to us from Indiana University. Her research involves cross-strait marriages between, obviously, Taiwan and mainland China, and the issues in terms of national identity, citizenship, and national sovereignty that cross-strait marriage throws up. She's the author of Intimate Politics, Marriage, the Market, and State Power in Southeastern China. Our third speaker will be Vanessa Fong. She's an associate professor at the Harvard University Graduate School of Education. She's interested in China's one-child policy and the questions about education, gender, transnational migration, and demographic, medical, linguistic, and psychological anthropology that the migration of Chinese only children throws up. And she's also the author of Only Hope, Coming of Age Under China's One-Child Policy, which won the 2005 Francis Hsu Book Prize from the Society for East Asian Anthropology. Our final speaker today will be Kenneth J. He's an associate professor of cultural anthropology in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, Baruch College, City University of New York. His current research focuses on Broadway, New York, as a gateway for a historical gateway for Chinese migrants to the United States. And he's the author of God in Chinatown, Religion and Survival in New York's Evolving Immigrant Community. Before we get started, I'd like to mention that in addition to the Asia program, this event is sponsored by, or co-sponsored by, the Wilson Center's Institute on China, the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States. All right, so without further ado, we'll turn to Professor Philip Kuhn.
Thank you very much, Bryce. Am I heard at the other end of the room? Good. Am I still heard?
Yes.
Seriously, I don't want to shout. I'm going to devote my 20 minutes to the subject I was asked to deal with, which was the history of Chinese migration. So if I can pack 5 centuries into 20 minutes, I will be given the Woodrow Wilson High Pressure Award. I'm going to talk about 4 subjects. One is the ecological and social background of Chinese migration. The second is migration and the Chinese state. Continues to be an important subject. Third is imperialism and mass migration. And fourth is the so-called new migration. It actually turns out to be new in some respects and not so new in others, as you might expect. That's China for you. Now, ecological and social background had to do with the drastic shrinkage of available arable land from about the 16th century onwards, so that indeed people in agriculture were not all necessarily needed in the family farm. So emigration is a subset of broader processes which continue today, meaning that people are forced out of their homes and into occupations which are not dependent on agriculture. Now, the idea that one should be forced out of one's home base in China was the last thing that people wanted to have happen. So the response to land shortage rested largely on a family system, which I will call the spatially extended family. It means that you are living together nominally as a family, even though your young sons may be off doing something else somewhere else. They don't lose their status as members of the family. And indeed, they don't cease to have responsibilities for the family. They keep sending remittances home. We all know about remittances from migrants. Well, it may well be that the Chinese, if they didn't invent remittances, they certainly played them as hard as they could. The Chinese family in this form was called a jia, J-I-A in romanization. And the jia was, in effect, a family treasury and a family bursary. It was a batch of property kept communally, and everybody, that is all the surviving sons, would inherit the resources of the jia when they got to a certain age, or when their father died. Now, as you can see, this jia configuration is exactly what is needed for migrants to make their presence profitable somewhere far from home. And when I say somewhere far from home, I mean that most of the migration that went on among Chinese in the centuries from the 16th to the present, actually, most of that energy is going into migration within China. In fact, in Chinese, there is no word for emigrate. They don't have the concept. They're beginning to get it today, although even so, I suspect that there are fuzzy edges around it, and the idea of going home again is, if not fully subscribed to, at least in the back of a lot of people's minds. So there's no concept for emigrate, and the jia is the base at home, which stays there until the very last moment, when you just can't get that last crop out of a tiny field in order to feed the family. Then the whole family may move. But the family migration is by far the smallest portion of Chinese migration, both historically and today. Now, the land shortage was felt all over China, but particularly in the southern provinces, which were hemmed in by mountainous terrain. But they were at the same time liberated by the ocean. The ocean was not a boundary line keeping them in. It was a set of known tracks out of the Chinese landmass into Southeast Asia. That, of course, had been used for many years prior to the 16th century. But I'm taking the 16th century as a benchmark because it's the time when European powers start making inroads into the Southeast Asian scene and providing venues for Chinese to go and make a living. Perforce, these Chinese who went to Southeast Asia were doing so. They went to Southeast Asia because they couldn't go, they really couldn't go anywhere else. That was their, you might say, domestic migration, but not quite. Now, the early colonial states were very happy to have some Chinese merchants around. The heads of the merchant communities were given special honors by the foreigners, and those honors included serving as bureaucrats within the colonial machinery. Europeans, it turns out, were not well suited for managing hot, humid, mosquito-ridden, difficult language areas in Southeast Asia. They just weren't up to it, and many of them died in the process. But the Chinese somehow knew how to do this, and they ran the tax systems of the foreign colonial powers in the form of tax collectors making bids up front for the amount that they would pay to the colonial government, and then going out and charging customers what exactly what the traffic would bear. So it was extremely profitable, and Sir Stamford Raffles, when he was acting governor of Java, testified that the 100,000 Chinese in Java were many hundreds of times wealthier as a group and as individuals than any Europeans on the scene. So the wealth of colonialism went first into the hands of Chinese and only afterwards into the hands of Europeans. Now, all this ecological background makes one wonder if the Jia system was not, in some social Darwinian sense, a product of the need to diversify one's labor over wider fields, rather than simply the initiator of it. If you go a long time getting your family living that way, it may operate in favor of a Jia system, although it's not something that I can prove. Now, migration and the Chinese state. It's often said erroneously that the Chinese state prohibited emigration. Well, it would be very difficult for them to do that because they hadn't actually conceived of the possibility that anybody would want to go out and separate himself from China. So people who did go overseas were in the early days, that is in Ming times, up to the 16th, 17th century. They must have been collaborating with foreigners to upset the legitimate Chinese regime at home. And so they were treated as potential turncoats. And it wasn't that they weren't allowed to go overseas, it was that they were not allowed to come home, which became quite a difficult situation in the 17th and 18th centuries, which I will get into in a moment. Now, the state, in other words, was not hostile to migration as such, but the return problem continued to be a difficult row to hoe. How are these merchants going to go out, and how are they going to come home again without getting fleeced by local officials who wanted to take their wealth away from them, or blackmail them, even worse? So there came up into Chinese politics what I'm going to call the maritime interest. Once the trade became sufficiently brisk in the late 16th century to warrant the state considering it as a support for a proper state treasury, the maritime interest consisted of a number of local officials getting together with merchants and lobbying. This was actually I once called it the maritime lobby, but I thought that was a bit too contemporary sounding. The maritime interest were those people who realized that cutting off trade would have been disastrous for the fiscal health of the empire, and so they actually succeeded in 1754 to get a decree out of the emperor by presumably playing the deal market all the way up the bureaucratic ladder, to the effect that whenever there are people crossing the sea to trade, no matter whether for long periods or short, they should all be permitted to return home. Now, this decree was promulgated, and it didn't make that much difference right off the bat because local officials tended to make their living off blackmailing returning merchants. But it did sort of form a watershed beyond which Chinese merchants overseas were somewhat more confident that they'd be able to return to their home precincts. And indeed, there's plenty of mention in Chinese gazetteer literature to the effect that people in these two provinces in the south of China, Fujian and Guangdong, had a lively traffic from Southeast Asia back home and out again. Now, in 1909, the Chinese state decided that they were going to make citizens out of all Chinese overseas through patrilineal descent. And this jus sanguinis, the bloodline criterion for Chinese citizenship, had rather an ambiguous outcome. It was not from the Chinese overseas asking that it be implemented, but it got them into a lot of trouble with indigenous populations who thought that these Chinese over in their neck of the woods might possibly consort with a great modernizing neighbor up above the horizon. So it was a mixed blessing. Now, imperialism and mass migration really began in the 18th century, as China and England both participated in penetrating the Southeast Asian trade routes, the Chinese exporting labor and the British getting bases from which they had planned to jump to the China trade. The island of Penang was the first such British acquisition, and this was followed not too long afterwards by the annexation of Singapore. What this did was to draw more and more Chinese down to the free trade ports of Penang and Singapore, which were unique in making up their port expenses by just the tax on trade, but not a free-floating tax on merchants. The Opium War established Western control over the treaty ports, a set of special ports on the China coast, which did not admit of the use of Chinese law to govern the actions of foreigners or the Chinese that foreigners hired. This control of the treaty ports enabled Chinese agents of foreign merchants to gather together, sometimes by force and fraud, sometimes by money, promises of money, into large labor gangs to be shipped overseas, just at the time when African slavery was being replaced by Chinese and Indians all over Southeast Asia. So imperialism and mass migration followed as the night follows the day, and often with a very cruel indenture system binding them to their employers. And of course, the mass migration became mass partly because of the advent of steam transport. Up until the 1850s, there was no reliable steam transport to take people out of China and into foreign ports. Now Chinese are going to all sorts of new venues, including not just the Southeast Asian colonies of the settlers, but what are actually called settler societies, namely the underpopulated lands of North America and Australasia. So it was in the mid-19th century that Chinese first start coming to the Pacific coast of North America and to Australia, coming to pan for gold as everybody else was in that time. Now, the new migration really begins with World War II. I call it the Pacific War, which is kind of a non sequitur. But the Pacific War had two effects on Chinese migration. First of all, the colonial system was out of commission after the Japanese were chased away, and they turned upon their Chinese immigrants with vengeance because they simply didn't have any way of asserting their nationality unless it was against a screen of Chinese a background of Chinese villainy at the hands of the colonialists as colonialist agents. See, the Chinese had the virtue of being second-class citizens, but the indigenous populations of Southeast Asia were third-class citizens, and they knew it, and they didn't like it. So the Chinese had a very difficult time, and in some ex-colonies, such as Indonesia, still do. Anti-Semitism in Southeast Asia was rampant, but its historical roots are very clear in the colonial system. Now, shortly after the war, China closes up in 1949, closed, in other words, to out-migration and in-migration, cutting itself off from contact with Chinese overseas. We then see at the end of the Mao era, 1978, 79, an advent of what came to be called the floating population, estimated at some point in the last 10 years as being between 80 million and 100 million people reacting to a shortage of arable land even more dire than had been the case in the 18th century. So the floating population heads for the coasts, industrialization, and sometimes emigration if they can do it. But the real field for the new Chinese migration is at home. And it is indeed a very busy industrialization scene. Am I out of time? 2 minutes. 2 minutes. When Deng Xiaoping made his speech in 1982 to the effect that he was facilitating the shift to free trade, he justified this just as the Chinese emperors did in the 18th century, saying that we know that we are in charge of this operation, in distinction from what happened 100 years earlier with foreign powers in charge of China coast trade. Frontier enclaves of the Deng Xiaoping variety were the successors of frontier enclaves under the treaty port regime, which in turn were successors of the frontier enclaves out in the Southeast Asian colonial system, where the Chinese had special arrangements for doing business with Europeans. I think that's all I have time for.
Okay. Right. I mean, we might be able to cover some more stuff in question and answers.
All right.
Right. Thank you very much. Our second speaker is Sara Friedman. Sara. Okay. Did you want to sit on this? Okay.
So Bryce, do I point at the computer?
It'll probably work wherever you point it. Yeah.
So I'm going to switch to a much shorter time frame and a much narrower geographical scope than Professor Kuhn just talked about. Marriages between mainland Chinese and Taiwanese do not make big headlines in China or the US, but they do in Taiwan. In 2003, when this magazine came out, 1 in 5 marriages registered in Taiwan that year involved a mainland Chinese spouse. By 2009, last year, that figure was holding steady at roughly 1 in 10 marriages. Given the contested nature of relations across the strait, the influx of several 100,000 mainland Chinese, most of whom are women, has provoked considerable debate in Taiwan about how best to integrate these women and their so-called foreign counterparts, primarily women from Southeast Asia. Although these marriages, cross-border marriages in Taiwan, have tapered off in the past few years, they continue as a prominent social trend that has transformed Taiwan from an immigrant sending society to an immigration destination in its own right. So in my brief 20 minutes today, I want to look at these cross-strait marriages through 2 related lenses. The first asks how marital migration across the strait relates to other contemporary forms of marital outmigration from the mainland, as well as to some of the broader Chinese migration patterns, both domestic and international, that Professor Kuhn just talked about. And then secondly, how do cross-strait marriages differ from some of these other patterns? Precisely because they've been shaped by contentious ties across the strait and Taiwan's uncertain standing in the international community. Because mainland spouses in Taiwan come to stand in for the state of cross-strait relations more generally, they're treated differently from all other categories of marital immigrant in Taiwan. This creates a tiered immigration and citizenship structure that replicates, and one might argue, reinforces Taiwan's own second-class standing on the global stage. So historically, migration from the mainland to Taiwan was viewed as internal, domestic movement to a frontier or a border region. And most of these migrants hailed from Fujian and Guangdong on the southeast coast. This picture changed in 1949 when the Kuomintang retreated to Taiwan after its defeat in the Civil War, bringing with it soldiers and civilians from all over China. And this group came to constitute what's known in Taiwan today as mainlanders, or 外省人, in contrast to the more long-standing Chinese population that began to immigrate to Taiwan in the 17th century, known as Taiwanese, or 本省人. Contrary to popular assumptions, it is not only mainlanders or their descendants who are marrying mainland Chinese today, but also considerable numbers of Taiwanese as well. So this most recent wave of marriages across the strait began in 1987 with the renewal of ties and the opening up of travel from Taiwan to the mainland. Cross-strait unions build on a growing trend of domestic migration within China to inland cities and coastal areas, as well as broader reform-era changes in marriage, family formation that have led to rising divorce rates and also changing marital expectations more generally. Cross-strait marriages also resemble other kinds of migration trajectories in that they're generally not imagined as a finite path from home to destination, but as the ability to maintain and even enhance ties across the strait, and in some cases to enable subsequent migrations beyond the region. So let me start with a brief vignette that will shed light on some of these linkages and shared migration histories. I had met Zhao Cuiping at the offices of a Taipei NGO in the fall of 2007. We spent one afternoon wandering around a botanical garden while Zhao told me about her past life in a major city in China's interior and how she had come to marry her elderly veteran husband, a former resident of that same city, who was nearly 30 years her senior. Born in 1960, Zhao had graduated from high school and then worked for many years in a state metallurgy company before resigning in the late 1990s to start her own tailoring business. Her first marriage ended after her husband had an affair, and her 23-year-old daughter was now studying for a PhD in the United States. Zhao met her second husband in their shared hometown in China shortly after he had purchased an apartment there. She assumed they would reside in China after marrying in 2004, but his persistent conflicts with his younger brother and his family led the couple to decide to move back to Taiwan. As a result, Zhao found herself living in one of Taipei's poorest districts and spending most of her time caring for her husband. She occasionally worked as a janitor on the weekends, but her husband resisted any suggestion that she take on full-time employment. As a result, they got by on the meager monthly stipend that he received from the Veterans Administration, and she confessed to feeling guilty and anxious about her inability to support her daughter during her studies. We stopped to rest in a pavilion, and an older, well-dressed gentleman approached us and struck up a conversation with me in stilted English. He explained that he had lived in Canada for 6 years after emigrating there with his daughter, who had married a wealthy man in Taiwan. As the conversation quickly moved beyond his English ability, he switched to Mandarin, and Zhao invited him to join us. Intrigued by Zhao's accent, he told us that he was originally from Shandong, and he had come to Taiwan when his high school picked up and moved across the strait in 1949. After graduation, he passed the Air Force examination, enabling him to enter elite military service. He had married another mainlander woman, 15 years his junior, and they had 3 children. So I was struck by some of the resemblances and differences between this man's life trajectory and that of Zhao and her husband. This man had come to Taiwan as a student and had obviously done very well for himself in the Air Force, enough so that he could marry another mainlander woman and build a family in Taiwan. Zhao's husband, by contrast, had arrived as a poor soldier and had never married until he met Zhao decades later. Whereas this man now claimed both Taiwanese and Canadian citizenship, Zhao herself faced another 4 or 5 years before she would be eligible, and she was far from certain that she wanted it. Nor could she imagine spending the rest of her life in Taiwan, especially once her husband died. So ironically, in this way, Zhao and the elderly gentleman faced similar citizenship dilemmas, although neither recognized it at the time. After confirming that Zhao was not yet a Taiwan citizen, this man turned to me and explained, quote, "Chinese spouses want to get Taiwan citizenship. At that time," referring to the late 1940s, "we didn't," close quote. So regardless of whether Zhao in the end seeks Taiwan citizenship, she might very well, as she later confessed to me, move to live with her daughter wherever her daughter settles down. Despite the parallels and divergences in their experiences in Taiwan, what Zhao and this man might share in the end is not merely long-term residence in Taiwan and past histories in the mainland, but also a portion of their lives spent further abroad in North America. So to understand some of these convergences in immigration trajectories, let me look briefly at cross-strait marriages in a comparative perspective. If we look overall at marital outmigration from China, outmarriages are not terribly statistically significant. They account for no more than 1% of all annual registered marriages since 1990. In the early market reform era, it was primarily unions with Hong Kong and Macau residents that dominated this marital landscape, as Chinese residents sought to gain access to modern lifestyles and forms of mobility that weren't available to them domestically. By mid-decade, you also see an increase in marriages with foreigners, non-ethnic Chinese, including couples who meet in China proper and those who met over the internet. But by the end of the 1990s, both groups were overtaken by cross-strait unions, a trend that continued to the middle 2000s. And you see the impact of cross-strait marriages on overall marriage migration trends most clearly in 2003, 2004. So this is the overall outmigration, and these are cross-strait marriages right here, when Taiwan implemented a border interview system to weed out couples in ostensibly sham marriages, and that resulted in an overall decline in marriage outmigration from China. So who are cross-strait couples? There are 3 broad types. Of course, they overlap, and they've changed over time. Initially, many looked very much like Zhao Cuiping and her husband. Veterans who had come to Taiwan with the Kuomintang, many of whom had never married for a variety of reasons that I'm happy to talk about, and who, when ties reopened in 1987, were quick to return to China to visit their families, and many of whom then looked for spouses who would return to Taiwan and care for them as they aged. Hence, these are often called, by immigration bureaucrats, caretaking marriages. The women in these marriages tend to be middle-aged, themselves divorced or widowed. Many have teenage or adult children in China or further abroad. They often come from veterans' home provinces, many in the interior. And many of them came of age just shortly before or during the Cultural Revolution, and hence their educations were cut short by political upheaval. Some of them hail from the countryside, but most from urban areas where they worked in state-owned and collective enterprises. And by the reform era, they found themselves facing an increasingly competitive employment marketplace that put them at a disadvantage when competing with younger workers. They also faced poor remarriage prospects in China. And this combined with perceptions of greater income-earning opportunities in Taiwan to encourage these women to marry veterans who were, in many cases, as much as 20 or 30 years their senior. The second type of cross-strait marriages involves a more diverse group, working-class and middle-class men in Taiwan who, for various reasons, are disadvantaged on the domestic marriage market, and younger to middle-aged women in China from a variety of backgrounds. These are men from both mainlander and Taiwanese backgrounds. They might be older and never married. They might be poor. They might have a disability. They might be divorced or widowed and have young children who need care. These features make it difficult often for them to find wives in Taiwan, and they turn to China or sometimes Southeast Asia to find spouses. Their Chinese wives range in education, although they tend to be concentrated around the junior middle school or high school level. They come from all parts of China. They might themselves be divorced with small children, or they might be marrying for the first time but have passed their prime marriage years for a variety of reasons. These couples meet through different channels, formal marriage brokers, introductions, the internet, or when the Taiwan spouse visits China for work or pleasure. And for younger women especially, they often meet after the woman has already migrated domestically to a city or the coast and meets the Taiwan spouse there. Now, the final group, which is growing in number, reflects the greater numbers of Taiwanese who are living, working, and studying in the mainland. These are couples who are closer in age, who have comparable educational and employment backgrounds. And many of them actually remain in China to work there. Some relocate to Taiwan, oftentimes temporarily when they have children. And in this group, you also find growing numbers of Chinese men married to Taiwanese women, as well as couples who meet in a third country when they've gone abroad for advanced study or for travel. So these diverse categories show that the stereotypical image of the mainland wife as someone looking for a better economic livelihood and the Taiwanese husband as poor or otherwise disadvantaged fails to reflect the complex face of cross-strait marriages. Marriages with veterans have only ever accounted for about 10% of all cross-strait unions, and they will inevitably decline together with the veteran population. With now over 1 million Taiwanese resident in China and the imminent opening up of Taiwanese universities to mainland students, cross-strait marriages involving younger partners with similar ages and backgrounds are likely to dominate in the future. Additionally, if we look at the motivations that Chinese spouses themselves give for marrying Taiwanese, we see how they reflect some of the dramatic social and political changes that have swept across reform-era China. In addition to fate or love, we see age pressures, poor remarriage options following divorce, the desire for a change of environment in the face of a romantic breakup or a business failure, the search for a companion or a caretaker, and aspirations for mobility that aren't available in China, perhaps because of limited educations or geographic disadvantages. These marital motivations may lead women to marry men who are older and possibly less educated, and it's not uncommon for mainland spouses to experience poorer living conditions in Taiwan than they enjoyed in China, and this is also the case for women married to Hong Kong men. Women with higher levels of education are also at a disadvantage in the Taiwanese job market because their work experience in the mainland is not always recognized, nor are at present degrees above the high school level. That said, many also acknowledge that in Taiwan they have access to greater welfare resources, opportunities for education, and a more modernized infrastructure system than they find in much of China. So what are then some of the important differences between cross-strait unions and other kinds of marital immigration? I want to focus here on the distinctive policies that regulate mainland spouses after they move to Taiwan. In Taiwan, mainland spouses encounter an immigration regime that treats them differently from all other categories of foreign spouses. This arises from their ambiguous status as neither foreigners nor citizens. They constitute an in-between exceptional category that subjects them to different kinds of regulatory practices, laws, and bureaucratic entities. So whereas in mainland China, marital outmigration is a tiny percentage of total marriages, in Taiwan, as I mentioned at the beginning, the situation is precisely the opposite. Cross-border marriages more generally play a much more significant role demographically, socially, and politically. They increased from about 16% of all registered marriages in 1998 to a high of 32% in 2003, meaning, as I said, 1 in 3 marriages that year involved a non-Taiwanese spouse. Now, those numbers have declined since then, ranging from about 14% to 20% per year, or roughly 1 in 5 or 6 marriages. Of cross-border marriages more generally, marriages with a mainland Chinese are more than 50%. And in 2003, 1 in 5 marriages were with a mainland Chinese spouse. So as one might expect, a growing proportion of marital immigrants in Taiwan has aroused concerns about changing population profiles, both because Taiwan itself faces rapidly declining marriage and birth rates, and because marriage to a citizen constitutes the only widely available path to naturalized citizenship. So what does this immigration regime look like? It emerged gradually from 1992 onward. 87 is when relations are reestablished. In 1991, Taiwan establishes something called the Mainland Affairs Council under the Executive Yuan. And in 1992, it passes the act governing relations between peoples of the Taiwan area and the mainland area. And this act enabled Taiwanese to sponsor spouses, parents, and children from pre-1949 relationships, as well as those spouses married after 1987. Okay. So there's a couple of stages here. I'm just going to go over them briefly. What's called in bureaucratic parlance the old sequence has several stages to permanent residence, which is the equivalent of citizenship for Chinese spouses in Taiwan. Movement between the stages is determined by a quota system at this time or number of years. In 2000, a reunion stage was introduced that allowed Chinese spouses to remain in Taiwan for a longer period of time, a year, before having to leave the country. At the visiting relative stage, they had to leave every 3 months, and only in 1999 was that extended for another 3 months. So here, basically, you see a roughly 8-year time frame from first entry to citizenship. A new immigration sequence that came into effect in March 2004 after a much debated and hotly contested revision process revised this immigration sequence significantly. It did away with the residence-based quotas at those earlier stages, but it added a quota for permanent residence or citizenship of 6,000 persons per year. And this quota started to cause a big problem around 2007, 2008 as wait times after submitting paperwork extended for as long as a year. So your total time frame to citizenship was more like 9 years. And this long period meant that if something happened in the interim, a divorce, death of a spouse who became unwilling to serve as a guarantor or file papers, provide financial support, there were some exceptions to this, but a Chinese spouse could lose her legal status in Taiwan. So in comparison then to provisions for all other categories of foreign spouses, these regulations are both lengthy and complex. And this is just a brief comparison of the different legal structures that mainland spouses and foreign spouses come under. Foreign spouses under the so-called immigration law, mainland spouses under the Act. Also, prior to establishment of the National Immigration Agency in 2007, they were regulated by different bureaucratic entities altogether. Foreign spouses have not faced a quota system mainland Chinese have at various stages. And in general, foreign spouses can obtain citizenship at the fastest is within 4 years, and they obtain immediate residency and work rights upon first entry. Chinese spouses, up until last year, waited about 8 years to citizenship. They also had a delay for residency and a delay of 2 to 6 years for formal work rights in Taiwan. So the two issues at the heart of these regulations are work rights and the ability to obtain citizenship. Government officials justified these obstacles in both pragmatic and political terms. They argued that granting spouses work rights earlier in the process would simply exacerbate the problem of so-called sham marriages contracted merely for access to financial opportunity and possibly intensify growing unemployment. On the other hand, they portrayed the regulations as necessary both to assuage the concerns of pro-independence legislators and their constituencies and to protect Taiwan from greater encroachment by the mainland. Now, clearly, it would be unwise for the Taiwan government to include mainland spouses in the same category as foreigners, but by making the separate bureaucratic structure and its regulations substantially more demanding, officials and policymakers also reaffirmed broader societal doubts about Chinese spouses' ability to become full members of the Taiwanese nation. Now, I should just add in closing that reforms implemented last August have improved the situation of mainland spouses somewhat, although not fully equalizing them. So they've done away with that reunion stage at the beginning. Spouses now, once they enter and pass the border interview, can apply immediately for kin-based residence and get work rights at that stage. So now the total time frame is 6 years, again, as compared to 4 years for foreign spouses. So let me conclude by just briefly commenting on what this means in terms of a sense of belonging and other migration trajectories. Many mainland spouses claim that they do not want to become Taiwanese citizens. And yet, in the absence of any kind of secure residency status that would enable them to obtain permanent standing in Taiwan outside of citizenship and also independent of their marriages, most end up applying for citizenship once they're eligible. Many make this decision amidst considerable doubt and anxiety, especially because Taiwan requires them simultaneously to give up their official mainland hukou. Will they become ineligible for pensions and other insurance benefits in the mainland? Might they want someday to move back, given the mainland's growing economy and potentially more profitable business opportunities? And will they ever feel at home in Taiwan? And will giving up their mainland residence alienate them further from their birthplace? Not all are plagued by these questions, but they emerge on a strikingly regular basis in conversations with mainland spouses from all walks of life. And as the example of Zhao Cuiping showed, musings on citizenship choices often turn to thoughts of future migratory paths that may link cross-strait marital trajectories to other Chinese migrations. Thank you very much.
Very good. Our next speaker is Vanessa Fong. Vanessa Fong.
I have a different.
Oh, do you? Okay.
All right, I am going to talk about Chinese youth who study in developed countries. Specifically, I am going to talk about the findings from my longitudinal project, which is based on a survey of 2,273 students aged 13 to 20 in a vocational high school, college prep high school, and junior high school that I conducted in 1999, and then resurveys of 1,084 of the same youth who were first surveyed in 1999 255 of whom had studied abroad. So between 2008 and 2010, right now as we speak, I'm still collecting surveys. I try to track down as many as possible of the original 2,273 who I had surveyed in 1999, when they were between ages 13 and 20. So I wanted to see what happened in those 11 years between 1999 and now, 2010. What did they do after they graduated junior high school and high school? What trajectories did they take? I originally was not intending to study Chinese youth who study abroad. My work is on Chinese child rearing and education and the long-term effects of that for the first generation that came of age under China's one-child policy. So the generation that was born between 1979 and 1986, I really wanted to see what their lives were like growing up in China, and then how they would raise their own children and how their own upbringing would affect the way they raise their own children. So I thought I would be just in China studying these people, as they went through the life course. But they had other plans. So between 1999 and 2010, 24% of the ones I found so far went abroad to study. And I was very surprised by this. Even though they had told me when they were teenagers that they really wanted to study abroad and they believed they were going to do it, I always thought it was kind of a pie in the sky, because these were regular working class families mostly. Most of their parents were factory workers who really couldn't afford to pay for the high price of tuition and even the plane ticket and visa fees and broker fees that they would have to pay to study abroad. Also, they were academically average students. I got them from schools that were not key point schools. So they were not the top students in China. In fact, that group is missing largely from my sample. The very top students, the students you might see here in the top universities in the United States, those are missing. Like at Harvard, the students who come to Harvard are very different from the students in my sample. My graduate students, my students who come from China's top universities were in the top high schools and the top junior high schools. And I did not do my survey at any of the top high schools or junior high schools. I did my survey at the median, the average. So they were academically average and socioeconomically average people. And I thought, well, given how hard it is to study abroad, I didn't think very many of them would go abroad. Maybe a few would. But to my surprise, when I did the survey and when I did participant observation in their homes and their schools over the course of 11 years, every year I went back and stayed with families and hung out with them and did participant observation in their social networks. Ever since 2008, I've been holding class reunions for them every year. I realized, it's based on what they told me, that many of them had gone abroad. Just by trying to track them down, where is he? She's studying abroad. Oh, okay. Okay, I guess I'm going to have to study this issue because I have to follow them wherever they go and follow them to the ends of the earth, literally in this case. So I've been following them to the ends of the earth. Between 1997 and 2009, I did over 3 years of participant observation in China. And then between 2003 and 2010, I did over a year of participant observation in transnational Chinese students' homes in Australia, Europe, Japan, and North America. So they studied abroad. They usually roomed in sort of very crowded situations with lots and lots of other Chinese students. And they were mostly just Chinese students because most other people could not stand living in such crowded conditions with Chinese students. Like sometimes they would try to live with students of other nationalities, either from other countries or natives of the country in which we're studying. But often these would fall apart because when you're living in such crowded conditions, communication is very important. And if these Chinese students do not speak speak the language of the countries very well, mostly Japanese and English. They don't speak these languages very well. And, just saying things like, take off your shoes, like Chinese students like to walk barefoot at home. They don't like to wear shoes indoors. There's an idea that you keep the carpet clean by not wearing shoes. And many other countries like to wear shoes indoors, and just trying to get them to take off their shoes and explaining the reason they have to do this was very difficult, especially when they were dealing with people from Africa and the Middle East and Latin America who could barely speak English, and then these Chinese students could barely speak English, and they were speaking broken English. Shoes, no shoes. No, I mean, at some point it becomes very challenging. So, whereas with Chinese students, they could feel pretty comfortable and communicate pretty well and sort of tolerate each other in very close quarters. Sometimes there would be 5 or 10 living in a room, like with bunk beds. And in China, a lot of college dormitories have like 8 people in a room. That's like in bunk beds with almost no space except for the bed and maybe 2 desks. And so it wasn't considered that bad. I mean, they felt very put upon that they had to live this way, but compared to what they would be doing in China, it wasn't that different. So many of them lived in these situations. I lived with them often. If one student had returned to China for a visit, or temporarily they had a bed vacant, I would sleep on that empty bed. Sometimes I was not lucky and all the beds were filled, so I would sleep on the floor in my sleeping bag. One time I had to sleep in the bathroom with cockroaches. So that's many of them lived in very difficult conditions, even though they had come from sort of middle-class families by Chinese standards. Once they were abroad, they had so little money that they had to live in sort of the worst housing, the worst districts, just because they had to save money. So I lived with them in a variety of countries. I followed them. The ones I knew from my original study, and I would get in touch with them via email and phone and instant messaging, and I would follow them wherever they went. And I also got to know their roommates, most of whom were also from mainland China. And then between 2000 and 2010, I also regularly kept up with them by email, phone, and instant messenger. And I kept up with them no matter where they were. So I'm very grateful for the internet, because it really enabled me to keep up with them. Many of them, moved. They moved so often that, even a telephone, I would have, their cell phone, but then they would change a country to a different country where the cell phone didn't work. They would change even their cell phone numbers would change. So, but their email, instant messaging, they would still have that. So often that was the only way. Sometimes there were a few times when even the parents didn't know where they were, and the parents were very upset about that. But it was often, when I had trouble tracking someone down, the last resort is to call the parents. But sometimes the parents didn't even know. It's like, where is this kid? But it was very hard to track them. But those who I managed to find, you see, I have 1,084. There are another 1,000 I have not yet found. I'm still hoping to find them, and I don't know if all of them are studying abroad or all of them are in China or the same percentage. But the percentage so far is really amazing. It's it's 24% of 1,084 of them have studied abroad at some time. Some of them are now back in mainland China, and some of them are still studying abroad, and some are back but temporarily but hoping to go abroad again, and some are they have very different situations, and it's really hard to say if any of them have finished, because they're never really finished. You don't know if they're going to go back abroad again, or if they're just if there's even if they've settled down. Many of them say, well, I got my bachelor's degree, but I'm hoping to go for a master's degree abroad. As soon as I find someone to marry and have a child and settle down, then I'm going to go abroad again. You wonder, are they really going to do that? But maybe they might. They've surprised me in the past, and maybe they will surprise me again. So this is very surprising for this city, especially. I worked in Dalian in northeastern China, which is a city that did not have a long tradition of emigration. It's not like the southern provinces and cities where they've been emigrating for many generations. In the city where I worked, only 1% of survey respondents' parents had ever left mainland China for any reason before 1999. And this is counting those who just left for one day as a tourist to go to Hong Kong or Taiwan. The question I asked was, has your mother ever left mainland China for any reason? So has your father ever left mainland China for any reason? And out of over 2,000 parents, only 1% of them had ever left before 1999, when their kids started going abroad. Now, once the kids went abroad, some of the parents visited them abroad, but it was still very few. So, many of the kids in this generation, well, they're not kids anymore, they're young adults. Many of the young adults in this generation are the first ones in their families, often the first ones in their entire social networks to go abroad. So they're the pioneering generation. The city has not had a tradition of going abroad, and in the past, most could not afford it anyway. But now they can just barely afford it. And the generation that is considered most likely to benefit is this generation, the generation that was born after China's one-child policy and has much higher education than their parents and is seen as the generation that is part of the developed world already within China. And going abroad is the next logical step of that. So by 2010, 24% of them had studied abroad. So they went to all different countries. The most common country for them to go to was Japan, with 32% of them having studied in Japan. Now, when I asked the question, I asked, have you ever taken classes outside mainland China? That was my survey question. So this counted people who went abroad on work visas or immigration visas or marriage visas or business visas or any other kind of visa, but took classes. Many of them, for instance, Japan, almost all of them had to take classes in Japanese to do anything because most of them knew little or no Japanese. It was not taught. Some of these schools, it was not taught at all. One of these schools, there was a Japanese track, but very few students were in it. So vast majority of them had only learned English. They had not. Many of them who went to Japan had never spoken a word of Japanese prior to going there. So that included a lot of them who worked in Japan but took Japanese language classes. So Japan was the most common. It was also the one of the few countries that allowed a lot of Chinese students to work. Most other countries had a lot of restrictions, either saying Chinese students or any kind of foreign students could not work at all, or saying you could only work a limited number of hours. Japan had actually lots of work visas for things like customer service or computer programming or some factory assembly line work. There were a lot of jobs that they actually recruited Chinese youth for. They recruited high school graduates, technical school graduates, and especially college graduates for these jobs that Japan, as you know, has a very it has a shrinking pool of young people. It has it's an aging population, and it's hard for Japan to get enough labor to do all the work it needs done. So Japan offered more work opportunities than other countries. So many of these students who came from working class families had difficulty paying for their education, and the only way they could do it was by working a lot. And Japan actually allowed legal work. Many of the other countries, they had to work illegally to pay for their education because they just couldn't earn enough to pay for living expenses and tuition. So for Japan, many of them went on work visas. Some went on student visas, and they had the opportunity to basically not depend on their parents for their tuition and living expenses, and work their way, just basically pay for their own educational expenses, which is very important for this group, which is mostly from working class families. They also, during that period, 1999 to 2010, especially during the earlier part, the early 2000s, it was easier to get into Japan. Japan gave out visas more readily than many other countries, especially after September 11, 2001. The United States and some other countries did not give out visas so easily. So now it's much stricter. Now Japan does not give out visas very easily either, because there was such a huge number of immigrants, many of whom came from mainland China, some of whom came from Southeast Asia, that they've tightened it up. But that period, Japan was the most common. Ireland also had very easy visa terms. It was very easy to get into Ireland during the early 2000s. Now it's much tighter for the same reason. They were sort of terrified by all the sudden wave of foreigners from all over the world that came when they made it so easy to go there. But early 2000s, it was much easier to get into Ireland than any other Western country, mostly on student visas, not on work visas. And Ireland was also the Celtic tiger. It was the economy was booming. The economy is no longer booming, so now it's totally different. Now very few Chinese students would want to go there, and they're not giving out visas anyway. So this is a snapshot of history when there was a moment when Ireland was the second most popular destination for students from my sample. And then Britain was easier than the United States and Canada with regards to giving out student visas, and it was also seen as very prestigious. So the wealthier families would send their children to Britain for study abroad. Australia it had very good immigration opportunities, but it was harder to get in. You had to have better credentials. United States, very hard to get in after 2001, and then but it's gotten easier toward now. It's loosened up considerably. There was a time between about 2001 and 2008 when it was really, really difficult, and very few were able to go there. Now, actually, many of the ones who came to the USA came later or very recently. Canada, many of the same issues as the USA, somewhat easier. New Zealand, much easier to get in, but not as prestigious by Chinese student standards. Singapore had some special policies for very talented Chinese students, but didn't always, very few of my sample could qualify for those. And then there were some other countries, very few other countries. So they went all over the world. They often did not care that much which country they went to. They just wanted to go to one of the developed countries, and they wanted to be part of the developed world that would be a loosely organized and flexibly bounded but increasingly powerful, exclusive, and united formation of countries and individuals that consistently place at the top of GDP per capita rankings and recognize each other as political and military allies. So these countries that they pick are these countries that are currently at the top of the world, and they go abroad because they want to get useful and enjoyable education that they believe would be better than what they could get in China. They feel many of them feel that comparable universities in China will not teach them as much as what they could get, the universities they get into abroad could teach them. They want more prestigious educational credentials. Often they can get into, with their high school credentials and test scores, they can get into schools abroad that are seen in China and abroad as more prestigious than what they could get into in China. They want to get better jobs in China or abroad. Many of them actually don't want to stay abroad forever. They want to get a job in China, but they want a job at the same salary they would get abroad. So that's something that often transnational corporations will pay their employees almost as much as they would pay them abroad if those employees have the exact same credentials as those they hire abroad. So whether they stay abroad or return to China, they would get better jobs, or so they believe. They want to have more spending power, whether by earning money abroad and taking it back to China, or by getting a better job abroad. They want to become more capable, cosmopolitan, and self-reliant. They want to gain the right to travel anywhere in the world. Where once they've gone abroad, or it's much easier to get visas to go to other places. They want to avoid restrictive social expectations. Like in China, there's a standard path of you go to college, you get a job, you marry, you have a child at a certain age. There's a life course that you have to follow, and many of them think it's too restrictive. And once abroad, no one is watching over them or nagging them, so that's always fun. They want to avoid complex instrumental social relationships. Many of them say that in developed countries, people do not have such dense social networks and expectations. They want to fulfill social obligations, and they feel upward mobility will help them do that, and going abroad will bring them upward mobility. They want to have a good quality of life, and they believe that developed countries have a better quality of life. And they want to have good health, and they believe that going abroad there's less pollution, there's better access to food that is not tainted. Often they are often disappointed though, because with many of these things, these expectations that they have to some extent are true, but in other ways are not true, and in some ways are actually worse for them because they become sort of lower class than they were in China. Their socioeconomic status actually decreases compared to the people around them in these countries. So they live in sort of the worst areas and have access to the least benefits. So I think I am out of time, but I will be glad to talk more during the question and answer session.
That's great. Thank you very much, Vanessa. The next speaker is Kenneth Guest. Sorry.
They're great pictures. You won't want to miss them. Let's see. Thank you. Hello, everyone. We're going to turn to a slightly different cohort of Chinese immigrants. My paper is Chinatown Buses, All-You-Can-Eat Buffets, and the Expanding Transnational Labor Migration Circuit. Let's see if we can... Yes. So on the steps of the Universe Bus Company waiting room in an old storefront on East Broadway, Lower Manhattan, Mr. Ke Liang, age 28, and his friend Mr. Tong'an Lu, age 21, both recent immigrants from Fuzhou, China, wait for the 10 p.m. departure of their bus to Wisconsin. The two men have been working for 8 months at a restaurant in a town on Interstate 94 near exit 62. They don't know the name of the town, only the interstate and the exit number. The Greyhound-style 57-passenger bus will head west to Chicago, where the young men will be switched to a smaller 15-passenger van that will deliver them to exits along the interstates from Michigan to Minnesota. From the exit, a cell phone call to the restaurant owner brings a car to meet them and bring them back to their jobs. 8 months is a long time to work in a Chinese restaurant where 6-day work weeks and 14-hour work days are the norm, where the workers live and eat in the restaurant building, and they only talk with the other workers because none of them speak English. But Mr. Liang breaks the monotony with regular trips back to New York City on the Chinatown bus. This 3-day visit that he's just been on included a gambling visit out to Atlantic City, wiring money back to his family in Fuzhou, catching up with old friends at the Village Temple and the Hometown Association, then visiting, a number of other recreational activities. Now he's off to Wisconsin again to continue making the money he needs to pay off his $70,000 smuggling fee and bring his younger brother from the village. So this paper is about Chinatown buses. This is a waiting room. This is about Chinatown buses, not the ones you may have heard about or even ridden on. Anybody been on the Chinatown buses? A few of you have. All right, so you can go from New York to Boston for about $15. You can go from New York to Washington for about $20. Those buses have had a part to play in the recent history of the Chinese migration industry, but today they've largely crossed over into the mainstream U.S. transportation industry, carrying students and budget travelers and a few Chinese. This paper is instead about the dozen or so bus companies set up and run by immigrant Chinese entrepreneurs that are off the transportation grid for everyone except the Chinese restaurant workers, like Mr. Liang and Mr. Lu, who ride them in the dead of the night to places across the U.S., known to them only as interstates, exits, area codes, and restaurant names. These buses are moving tens of thousands of workers in a continuing labor circuit of labor migration that's orchestrated by a dynamic Chinese migration industry centered in New York City. All right. This paper is also about the changing role of New York's Chinatown in the Chinese immigrant experience. For much of the 20th century, New York's Chinatown has been the primary gateway for working-class Chinese immigrants arriving in the U.S. Wave after wave of Chinese men and women have found work in laundries, restaurants, garment shops, construction trades. Today, China's role is being transformed from gateway to hub, from receiving destination to a staging platform for further migration. In a highly synchronized ballet of labor movement, these migrant buses move migrant workers from a complex immigration center in Chinatown to a rapidly expanding network of Chinese takeout restaurants and all-you-can-eat buffets. The restaurants rely on these low-wage laborers to subsidize their costs and make them competitive in the food industry niche available to them in towns and cities across the U.S. Their demand for cheap labor stimulates and sustains a continuing flow of rural immigrants from Fuzhou, tens of thousands a year, who use New York City as a gateway despite the saturation of New York City's restaurant labor market with low-wage workers. For the past 15 years, I've been following the migration patterns and immigrant incorporation experiences of rural Chinese from the farms and fishing villages near Fuzhou, southeast China. My original work explored these experiences through the lens of religion. Oh, there's my book. Both in New York and in China, as Fujianese immigrants created and recreated religious communities, rituals, and meanings, and used them to build transnational links between New York City and home, as well as using them as ways of building an alternative mode of understanding outside of the framework of the U.S. state. For those of you who are unfamiliar with this recent Chinese immigration, since the 1980s, hundreds of thousands of new immigrants from outside of Fuzhou, mostly rural, have been making their way to New York to work in restaurants, garment shops, construction trades, spurred by a lack of opportunity at home, the promise of jobs in New York and beyond, and facilitated by an international smuggling industry. Able-bodied men and women of all ages have been pouring out of these rural areas, leaving behind hometowns populated only by children, teenagers, and senior citizens. So this is Fuzhou City, the Min River, and a number of the sending villages along the coast. The arrival of the Fujianese has also transformed New York's Chinese community. Well, here's some photos of, this is Fuzhou City. Actually, so it's really quite developed. You got your McDonald's and your Kentucky Fried Chicken. And then these are the farming villages, areas that people are coming from along the river. They're fishing areas. So you can get a sense of where people are coming from. The combination of old traditional style roofs and the new 5-story buildings built with remittances in the background. All right. So for most Fujianese, New York City is their first stop in America, and they've transformed the Chinatown community. They've largely supplanted the Cantonese as Chinatown's largest ethnic community, and they're vying for leadership in the area's economic, politics, social life, and even language use. So this is a little map of Lower Manhattan. If anybody, this is Canal Street running across here. This is the older Chinatown if you've been to Mott Street, Canal Street. But with the Fujianese immigration, Chinatown has now expanded up through Little Italy and east to the Lower East Side. So it's a dramatic transformation of the local Chinese community and the Lower East Side of Manhattan. They utilize New York City to connect with family, friends, home villagers. They begin to mobilize social capital, financial capital that they need to repay their migration costs and to develop a strategy for survival and success in the American society. A smuggling fee last year was over $70,000 a person. So this is a very heavy burden of debt that they arrive with. They speak little English, very unfamiliar with American dynamics. So in order to survive, Fujianese are turning to an ethnic economy and ethnic, social, and religious networks that have grown in and around New York City's Chinese community, and that more recently have been expanding into a network of Fujianese-run restaurants across the United States. All right, So my current research, of which this paper is a piece, focuses on the growing complexity and sophistication of this migration and incorporation process, and in particular the role of one street, East Broadway. This is this picture of the East Broadway in Lower Manhattan. Sometimes it's now called Little Fuzhou or Fuzhou Street. I continue to work on notions of transnational migration, pushing beyond the formulations of Chinese transnational economic elites, and to continue to look at the way that labor migrants, Chinese labor migrants, are creating and accessing transnational flows of ideas and goods and people. My current work also expands a concept of the migration industry that's been proposed by Ruben Hernandez Leon in a really interesting work on migration of urban Mexicans to the U.S. He identifies migration industry as a matrix of entrepreneurial activities and services that are an ensemble of entrepreneurs who, motivated by pursuit of financial gain, provide a variety of services to facilitate human mobility across international borders. All right. The Chinatown buses that I'm looking at are clearly part of this kind of a matrix, though they don't cross national borders. If we look at East Broadway and the East Broadway migration industry that's developed there, we see an amazing agglomeration of activities and services. So let's see. The yellow building there that you see is a Western Union building. All right. We have a Western Union and MoneyGram, remittance companies. We have lawyers specializing in immigration legalization. We have boards with apartments and jobs posted, immigration service centers. We have, where are we? Travel agents, money lenders, employment agencies, snakeheads, so these are the Chinese smugglers, people who provide legitimate and false documents. We have notaries, insurance agencies, let's see, wedding salons, if you need to get married, and all kinds of short-term housing, hometown associations, doctors, phone card sales booths, little temples, recreational options, including video stores, dim sum restaurants, gambling parlors, buses to Atlantic City. That's a very complex matrix of activities and services that reveal that not only does East Broadway function as a magnet destination and facilitate the movement of Fujianese across the international borders, but it also facilitates the movement of workers within the U.S. national borders as well, and supports their economic, social, political incorporation into the U.S. society. Let's see, where are we? Do you have a time?
I do.
Okay. I have to decide whether to skip this page.
You've got about 7 or 8 minutes.
Oh my goodness. So I'll turn quickly to consider the role of the Chinatown buses in the migration industry. The current...
or more. No, you've got a little more.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
The current extensive Chinatown bus system began in 1997. So you have Fenghua. I don't know if you've been to Canal Street in Bowery, but there's a lovely temple there and the big Fenghua bus stop there. Started in 1997 as Fujianese entrepreneurs, many with experience operating buses in a rapidly privatizing Chinese economy, began to see an opportunity to make money moving immigrant workers to restaurants beyond the New York metropolitan area as the Chinese restaurant industry expanded. Initially, small vans ran between New York City, Boston, Philadelphia, and Washington, later expanding to larger buses. Competition kept prices low and at times drove a one-way ticket cost to a rock-bottom $10 each way to some of these destinations. Bus companies were largely family businesses with the owner selling tickets, driving, running the whole thing on a shoestring budget, but continuing to earn a profit with very, very low labor costs. These low fares gradually began to attract U.S. students and budget travelers and gained the Chinatown buses a reputation that helped them cross into a mainstream transportation clientele who were unwilling to pay the fares of $80 on Greyhound $150 on Amtrak round trip, unless you take the Acela. That's even more. In fact, in early 2009, Coach USA, a major American bus company, purchased 2 of the most lucrative Chinese bus companies that were running New York City to D.C. routes because they had failed to compete with them head-to-head. Today, these original Chinatown bus lines, although operating outside the New York City bus transport infrastructure, for instance, they make curbside pickups. They don't have a slot at the Port Authority bus terminal. They are fully mainstreamed in terms of passengers, with a few restaurant workers mixed in. What I don't have time to show you, to talk much about, starting in 2000, a second bus network of dollar vans emerged that shuttle Fujianese from Manhattan's Chinatown to Sunset Park in Brooklyn and Flushing in Queens. These are just some pictures of little dollar vans that pick up on East Broadway and deliver people. All right. The long-distance Chinatown buses ridden by Mr. Liu serve as a direct link between Chinatown's 24 employment agencies and thousands of Chinese restaurants in this ethnic economy. It's worth noting that according to some recent restaurant industry trade magazines, there are now more Chinese restaurants in the U.S. than McDonald's, Wendy's, and Burger King's combined. So it's big business. And thank goodness we have some. All right. We're not finding you at McDonald's, I take it, Professor Kuhn. All right. Located along East Broadway, these employment agencies constantly solicit job postings from restaurant owners. Large books of restaurant cards. I have some pictures of these employment agencies. Large books of restaurant cards and handwritten names and phone numbers are the treasure of any employment agency, and staff are constantly updating their books. Workers circulate among the agencies, weighing factors such as the distance from New York City, the type of job, the level of pay. On-site interviews, telephone interviews match the workers with the owners, at which point the employment agency staff gives explicit instructions on how to get to the job, on the subway, on the train, on the bus. The employment agency staff is the key to orchestrating the labor migration ballet. They know exactly which company runs which routes, what days they run, and what types of departures and arrivals will be. So these are pictures from the walls of the employment agency. So you can see the whiteboards in the back with the listing of the jobs. They make the match. This nice lady would make the phone call, do the interview for you, help you with the interview, and then they have descriptions of the bus lines, the area codes for where people are going. And these would be an example of some of the bus company cards that you might get handed when you made the job match. Let's see. All right. So the owner of David Bus Company got into the business 7 years ago. She had opened here's some pictures of some of the other bus companies along the way. She had opened an all-you-can-eat buffet restaurant in Naples on the west coast of Florida. But she was having trouble getting workers from New York. So out of frustration, she bought a van and started transporting workers back and forth to New York herself. Today, her company dominates the Chinatown bus route along Interstate 95, south to Florida, with daily buses to Jacksonville, and connecting vans at Myrtle Beach and Charleston that shuttle passengers inland into North and South Carolina. In an Asian grocery store parking lot in Jacksonville, passengers also can transfer to her vans that run west along Interstate I-10 as far as Mobile, Alabama, and south along I-95, I-4, I-75, depending on the day of the week, serving both the coasts and the interior of Florida. One evening, here are just some more signs of all these bus companies, East Broadway again. One evening, I was standing on the sidewalk outside the David Bus Company storefront waiting room, and I watched every seat fill on the 8 o'clock departure. A few passengers even took little pink stools to sit in the aisles. Everyone was Fujianese. Most were young men, though perhaps a quarter were young women. The bus cargo bays told an additional part of the ethnic economy story. Along with the passenger luggage, the bus company staff packed the underbelly of the bus with restaurant supplies, woks, utensils, pans, along with styrofoam coolers of fresh fish bound from East Broadway fish markets to sushi bars in North Carolina. Even a large neon sign with Chinese characters made it on board, being couriered from a Chinatown sign shop to a new restaurant in South Carolina. One whole compartment under the bus was filled with brown cardboard boxes. On closer inspection, each box had a Chinese menu attached to it. Boxes of menus printed by one of the dozen East Broadway print shops, now bound for Pensacola, and I actually looked at all these menus, Pensacola, Ocala, Orlando, Sarasota, and Gainesville. Myths about the Chinatown buses and their true activities abound in New York City when you talk to people. It's a topic for another paper, stories of gang violence, outrageously bad safety records, smuggled guns, other contraband, none of which I found to be true. Well, the safety records sometimes. But the untold story of these long-distance Chinatown buses is their role as arteries in an international system of circulation that carries Fujianese labor migrants from rural towns and villages in southeast China to an expanding ethnic Chinese restaurant economy that feeds a hungry American clientele on the exploited labor of recent immigrants. And hidden within that more systemic analysis of the story is also the role of these buses as avenues for these immigrant workers to pursue their dreams. Good work someday, paying off their debts, maybe reuniting with their family, making a legal and good life for themselves and their children in this country. Thank you very much. Did I hit my time?
Oh yeah, you were just within. That's very good. Okay, thanks everybody. I'll open the floor up for questions now. Sue will come around with the mic, and if you could please introduce yourself by stating your name and any affiliation you might have. Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Joe Winder. I spent 30 years in the Foreign Service, some of which I spent around China, Indonesia, Thailand, and Japan, but never in China. And I wanted to ask Professor Kuhn a bit about whether he found any differentiation among the Chinese that had gone to non-Muslim countries, mainly Thailand and the Philippines, and those who had gone to Malaysia and Indonesia. Do they still maintain in, say, the third or fourth generation the same, from all four countries, the same links back to the mainland? Are they more, I mean, when we lived there and worked there, they at least pretended to be more citizens of that country, but I'm wondering if it's just a surface pretense.
Well, as far as I can tell, the Islamic component is not the decisive component in where they choose to migrate to and how they're treated. The difference between Indonesia and Malaysia has largely to do with the proportion of Chinese in the population. They're about 25% of the population. Whatever the Malaysians think of the Chinese, you cannot throw them out of the country because they would take their capital and be off with it. And in fact, they've already done so simply out of good business sense, that they can do things that the Malaysians can't. Now, in Indonesia, the animus against Chinese is also much, much stronger. And it's partly by the way that the Dutch managed their colonies. They were very hard-nosed. They ran some absolutely terrible plantations with god-awful conditions and made a very bad impression on the Chinese elite and commoners. So that even though the Chinese are 3% of the Indonesian population, they get treated much worse than the Chinese in Malaysia, largely because of this historical background.
What about Thailand and links the Chinese that moved to Thailand with China back then?
Yes. Now, the Thai situation is quite unique because Thailand was never colonized. It was briefly occupied by the Japanese during World War II, but it was never a foreign colony. Hence, the ethnic Thais in no way felt the same kind of insult and frustration that the Indonesians and the Malaysians did. Thailand also is notable for its hospitality to different ethnic groups. The only reason that they were really concerned about Chinese immigration was they were afraid of communism, which they had every right to be. But as far as getting along with the Chinese, they did very, very well indeed. They assimilated them into their Buddhist congregations. They co-opted them into their upper industrial elite. And even though a Thai king once said that the Chinese were the yellow peril in East Asia, they never really believed it, because the Chinese learned quickly how to take advantage of Thai hospitality and blend in. So that the mixed marriages and the mixed ethnicity of many Thais today, in fact, it is my impression that in this country, the Thai restaurants are mostly staffed and owned by Chinese. They've learned how to do Thai cooking, even though they've lost any awareness of the Chinese language. The other, if I may just add one point to the Thai situation, there's a good deal of bilingualism. It's been shown that the Chinese do not abandon Chinese when they learn Thai. When they're doing business with the bureaucrats or military people, they use Thai. At home, they use Chinese. So it's really a best of both worlds situation. And in fact, it's the only place in Southeast Asia where Chinese have gotten a fair shake. That's my personal impression.
Good. Next question over here.
We'll keep it coming down the table. Gene Martin, also former Foreign Service with Joe here. I did serve in China, so I had that opportunity. When I was in Guangdong, I was the Consul General in Guangzhou, and Chengla, outside of Fuzhou, was one of my districts. Okay. And it's a very interesting place to be, because you see the traditional farmhouse and then this 4-story mansion with the jacuzzi and the Mercedes in front. It's all from the remittances, shall we say, or the paybacks. But I'd like to ask a quick question of Dr. Fong. What do you find that the expectations of the sea turtles when they go back to China are met, particularly the question about getting better jobs in China? My experience in southern China is that a lot of the people, when they come back, they're very disappointed that they can't get a better job. And secondly, that they are what you would call between cultures, because they've lost their Chinese connections, if you will, their guanxi. And when they come back, they're neither Chinese nor Guaylo, and they're not foreigners either. And so the question is, they have a hard time. And American companies have had a lot of trouble hiring Chinese in this country, sending them back, and they're not working out. I'm just wondering what your observations were.
Yes, I found many of them were disappointed. Most of them did find better jobs than they would have found if they had never studied abroad, but they were not nearly as good as they had imagined. The first wave, which is earlier than this group and mostly in other cities that went abroad, did find really good jobs. The ones who studied abroad in the 1980s and early 1990s, because there were so few people in China who could do any business with foreigners, that just to be proficient in a foreign language just paved their way to any kind of job, and they could leapfrog over people with much more prestigious college degrees. But now, because so many of these only children are all studying abroad at the same time and all coming back at similar times, there's such competition that they can't get those good jobs anymore unless they actually got a degree from a very prestigious university abroad, which most of these kids in my sample, these young adults in my sample, could not. So most of them did get, the foreign language skills and the prestige of the foreign degree did help them somewhat, but many of them are disappointed. A few of them did manage to get really good jobs, and those are the same people who would have gotten really good jobs if they had stayed in China anyway, because they were extremely talented. So the story that I didn't get into is actually a story of a lot of disappointment in many ways.
Okay, I'm going to ask the next question because it's related to that, to Vanessa. You also talked about the expectations that these students had when they were overseas, and I'm kind of interested in Japan, but you can expand that out if you want. I'm wondering if the expectation that these students living abroad, whether their expectations were met while they were in their respective countries.
Most of them, their expectations were met, but not as much as they imagined, and they got higher expectations once they were abroad. So, for instance, many of them managed to buy cars. And they had said in China, if I could work my whole life and I would not have enough savings to buy a car, because a car in China costs the same or more than it costs in a developed country, but their salaries are so much less. So there's a smaller gap between their salaries and really high-end consumer goods, and their standard of living did increase. But once they're abroad, everyone has a car, so having a car is not that great anymore. It's just a way that you have to have transportation, and often in these countries you have to have a car. If you don't live in a major city, if you don't have a car, you can't get to work and you can't get to school and you can't get to the supermarket. So it's not a luxury consumer item. It's just something that is part of their life. And the same thing with hot running water, lack of pollution, or less pollution than they had in China. I mean, these are true. These things are true in developed countries. There is a better standard of living in many ways, but people get very used to these very quickly, and then they realize that they have a lot less of it than the college-educated natives of that country, and then they feel some of them were college-educated in China, but because they don't speak English well enough or Japanese well enough, they're working as waiters and sales clerks, and they often feel like they've dropped in their status. Since in China they would be an office worker. In these developed countries, they are working at jobs they would never work at in China. That's low-level service jobs, and so many of them were very deeply disappointed. And as they stayed longer, they became more disappointed when they started comparing themselves with natives of the country in which they were living, rather than with their peers in China. But at the same time, when they think about going back to China, or when they do visit China, they're not used to China anymore, and they're just horrified by the pollution and the bad traffic and lack of hot running water. And various things that make them, things that they could deal with when they were growing up and didn't think much was a problem. But once they went back, they were just so horrified by many of these things that they felt like they were no longer adjusted to any country. They were every country was full of flaws.
Okay, and I apologize. I'm going to ask another one. And it's related, so it's not really a new question. Were there any problems in terms of, what their perception of how the native population saw them, and with regulations that they found perhaps irksome?
Yes, actually, because they were students, and most of them were on student visas or work visas and not immigrant visas, they really didn't have a lot of the rights of natives. For instance, many of these countries charged them a lot more tuition. Some like, for instance, in Australia, Australian citizens would get free college or graduate school education. Everyone would have not only tuition all paid for by the government, but also a stipend, whereas Chinese students had to pay very high tuitions, and the Australian system is actually funded by foreign students. A big part of the funding is from the tuition from all over Asia. Many of the social welfare benefits were not available to Chinese students, and also even the ones that the protections that they had, they either didn't know about or were afraid to use. So there were a lot of housing regulations that were supposed to protect them from from landlords, but they were so afraid of making trouble and somehow losing their visa. They were always afraid that anything they did that to upset anyone, whether it's a landlord or employer or teacher or school administrator or classmate or roommate, like anyone could like sue them and call the police, and then they would lose their visa. So there was a sense that they couldn't use the legal protections that were there for them, either because they didn't know what they were or because they were too scared. They faced some discrimination. Different countries had different kinds of discrimination and reasons for discrimination, and also different socioeconomic statuses. Those who were in universities faced relatively little discrimination because university professors and students at least usually did not overtly discriminate. Those who were taking language school classes and doing sort of low-level service jobs faced a lot of discrimination, very overtly, lots of ethnic slurs against them. In the Western countries and in Japan, they faced a lot of just very nasty, sometimes even violence. Getting kids would throw stones at them and tell them to leave the country. In Ireland, actually very young children would throw stones at them, the very so it depended on sort of what context they were in. But for the most part, though, they had even higher expectations of racism than what they saw once abroad. So they kind of expected that they would be treated in racist ways. And when they were treated that way, they complained about it, but they thought it was sort of the price of being a foreigner. And when they were not treated that way, they were often very happily surprised and really praised the people in the country or in their university for being so tolerant of them. So, they were expecting much better socioeconomic conditions than what they experienced, but they were expecting about the level of racism that they experienced, and in some ways they were expecting more.
Mm-hmm. Good.
Yeah,
we'll move up that way.
The story by you three are very fascinating, and I would like to ask Dr. Fong, is somewhat related to his. I think it would be good that later you compare all them, their career, they are after the study. But I think I expect the people coming back will have some problem because we used to talk politics is local. I think everything is local. I think the coming back person is hard to compete with the people remain the country. But it will interest if you continue to that. Thank you.
Back, right up the back in the corner there.
Thank you. Thank you to all the panelists. My name is Kathleen Friedel, and I teach history at Berkeley, and I'm also a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center this year. My first question is for Sara. I'm just curious to know how this very specific out-migration pattern registers in mainland China. And I imagine that there's a number of narratives or perceptual frameworks and that those are diverse. But I'm curious to know specifically whether the special burden that's placed on mainland spouses in Taiwan is somehow perceived as symbolic of other sorts of political injuries against mainland. And then my second question is for Dr. Kuhn, who I have to gush a little bit, has actually written what I think is one of the best history books of all time called Soul Stealers. And if people haven't read it, they should run out and go buy it right away and read it. Because it's very rare I can utter that sentence, but it really is one of the best history books I've ever read. You talked about how historically anachronistic immigration was in imperial China, and and how that relates to Chinese Sinocentrism. And I'm curious to know how global migration, if you can say more about how global migration today, both out-migration and I think, as Vanessa rightly points out, a healthy share of Chinese immigrants returning to mainland China, how that relates to, I won't say an emerging or re-emerging Chinocentrism, but a new Chinese nationalism that's certainly resurgent. What relationship, if any, do those two things have with each other? Thanks.
Shall I take that one on?
Sure.
I think that the Chinese who went outside China as emigrants or visiting merchants before, let's say, the 1890s, had what you might call a culturalist affection for their old country. But there was no national state to which they could feel particular attachment. In fact, the Chinese government had been very aloof from the needs of the Chinese overseas. And it wasn't until they discovered that they could get lots of money out of them that they became a little bit more civil and accommodating. Then the nationalist element creeps in around the time of the Sino-Japanese War of 1895, in which China was forced to cede Taiwan to the Japanese. And this was the origin of most modern Chinese nationalist antagonisms, and rightly so. Now, how much the merchants overseas partook of this varied a lot with their degree of vulnerability. As I outlined in my book, no single Chinese government, there were three of them in the 20th century, the Kuomintang, the Wanjingwei collaboratist regime, and the communist regime. None of those people was in a position to help the Chinese overseas out of trouble. And in fact, the few times that they tried to do so were notable fiascos. So that, in a way, it's not surprising that business is business when it comes to supporting your family and surviving overseas. And so the idea of participating in a boycott against, let's say, Japanese bicycles is a tough sell to the average not-so-successful Chinese merchant. Considering how little the Chinese government paid attention to the overseas Chinese, except to done them for money, it's not surprising that some of them were not terribly eager to lay down their lives for the fate of some government many, many miles away, which they had never had occasion to get any benefit from. Does that answer your question? Sort of.
Thank you, Kathleen. So your question about how the treatment of mainland spouses in Taiwan registers in mainland China, I think my short answer would be not very much, period. It does register occasionally in the press, and they are typically negative press accounts when something happens, when somebody's treated particularly badly or there's some kind of an incident. But the real reason it doesn't register is less because of the small percentage of people who are going to Taiwan from the mainland, and more because there's very little information available in the mainland about these policies in Taiwan. Part of that has to do with the fact that you cannot easily access Taiwan official websites from the mainland. And so this has been a long-standing issue. It's been a point of discussion between Taiwan officials and mainland officials about how to better inform mainland spouses before they actually take the plunge and get married, which they have to do before they can go to Taiwan, about what kinds of policies they will face once they arrive. And so it's a real information gap more than anything, and it's not intentional on the part of Taiwan authorities. In fact, I think they would prefer that people knew more about what they were getting into, although they're not willing to go the step of, say, opening up a fiancé visa type of avenue. And I don't think then when it is portrayed in the media as questions of poor treatment or unequal treatment, that it's put in that same category as what you call other symbolic offenses against mainland Chinese. And that's precisely because of the way that Taiwan is portrayed in the mainland press. So incidents like the U.S. Fighter plane incident and other sorts of international offenses against mainland Chinese they're not framed in the same way in domestic discourse within the mainland. Yeah.
Does anybody have a question for Professor Guest? Do you? Yeah. Okay. Well, I have one. That's the end.
Okay. Professor Guest, I'm very fascinated with your presentation's really great. And we know lots of Chinese people here and how they came and how they made their way here and, sent all their kids to college while operating or working in Chinese laundries and Chinese restaurants. But I'm wondering, how do those people manage to pay $70,000 to their snakehead that brought them, while at the same time sending money back home to support the families that they have? Do they really manage to pay $70,000 apiece?
Yes.
Out of their minimum wage jobs?
Yeah, well, they're restaurants outside of the metropolitan New York area are part of the deal is housing and food. So they're earning cash and being put up and fed. So they are the only other expense. There are very, very few other expenses that they have. A trip on the bus back to New York every once in a while, a phone card, maybe because they're working 6 days a week in an all-you-can-eat buffet restaurant someplace in Wisconsin. There's nowhere to go. There's nobody else in the community who speaks Chinese. There's not even a sidewalk along the road to walk down to the mall. So they're usually volunteering to work an extra day for a little extra pay. And so, one of the fascinating things about these buses really also is how much money is traveling back and forth on them as workers move back, are going back to New York and sending money back to China. So the other interesting transition that's happened is that much of the money that's mobilized to pay the smuggling fees is no longer borrowed from the smugglers. There actually have been some banks established in China by the smuggling syndicates so that people can borrow directly from those. But as people have accumulated relatives here who have already paid off their debts, then one of the ways you continue to make money is to loan money. So many people, I'd say maybe even most people now mobilize the $70,000 from their extended kinship network. Or hometown village network, temples, churches, hometown associations all have revolving loan funds, and they're borrowing money from these folks at interest. So the smugglers are getting paid earlier in the process, but the debts are still being paid and pressured to be paid. A lot of folks are imagining, they say that they expect to work 4 or 5 years to pay off the debt at these restaurants, and in the process they hope to begin to send small amounts of remittances home. But it's after that's paid off, then they're expected then to contribute to the migration of the next person in the family. So the pressure just isn't off once they've made it out of their own debt. Yeah, and that's one of the things at Baruch, where I teach, and in the CUNY system, when I started there 9 years ago, there were very few Fujianese students, and right now I'm conducting a study of Fujianese students at Baruch, where I'm seeing a large percent of our Chinese population is from Fuzhou, but their parents many of them are restaurant workers or small restaurant owners. Oftentimes the father is outside of New York. The mother has stayed back, rented a small place in the New York City in order for that kid to go to high school in New York City. So it's a very rapid process through the system. Thank you.
Good. Okay, we have time for one more. If We have one more, but we don't. So, okay.
Could I ask Dr. Friedman, is there a particular impact because these are one-child families? Do they have less of a need to support their parents than traditionally Chinese children did?
Do you mean to ask the question to me or to Vanessa?
No, I thought you were talking about
cross-strait marriages that the spouses are from one-child families?
Oh. Yeah.
That's actually an interesting question. Very few of them are from one-child families, actually. Certainly the older women are not, but even the women in their 20s are very rarely from one-child families. I have seen occasional cases where they are, but most have at least one sibling. There are also cases where several siblings marry a Taiwanese. No, not the same one. But again, it's not unlike the kinds of networks that we're all talking about. One person marries, she introduces men to other people from her home community, sometimes even her sisters. Or a sister introduces a brother. I've seen cases like that too. So there are certain kinds of chains, which is why you tend to see consistency over time in what are the major sending provinces. Fujian has topped the list since about the mid-90s. Guangdong was at the top before that. But Hunan has been consistently second on the list now for quite a while. And now Sichuan was very high and still is, even after Chongqing was separated out as a separate administrative unit. But Guangxi is very high in the southwest as well. So there become chains of introduction as well as chains that are created through more formal marriage broker networks as well.
And my sample was almost all only children, and it did affect, it was a big reason why they could go abroad, because their parents could put all of their family's life savings into that plane ticket and one semester of tuition. Whereas, if there were another sibling, they would have more trouble or justifying putting so much money in a high-risk operation. Also, I think being only children made them very ambivalent about staying abroad, because their parents mostly could never migrate to a developed country. Most developed countries have policies that make it very hard for elderly people without work and without prospects to emigrate. So if they stayed abroad forever, then their parents would not see their grandchildren except on a few holidays. If their parents got sick, they would not be able to rush back very quickly if they had jobs abroad. I mean, they really took that into consideration. That's why a lot of them are thinking like they want to go back. They're very ambivalent about whether they want to stay abroad or go back, and they flip every day because the fact that they are only children is a big burden on them in that sense, because they really think, if I stay abroad, what's going to happen to my parents in China? So it made them more likely to go abroad, but more likely to go back, I think.
Okay, very good. We've gone over time, so let's call things to a close. If you'd like to join me in thanking our guests.